Okay, hello everybody. As you may or may not know, I'm doing today's lecture on religion, the religious perspective on sustainability. I'm normally one of your TAs, but this is an area of great interest to me, and I hope you'll find it interesting too. So, the religious perspective on sustainability. I think it's a pretty compelling subject, and one which you might have or might not have thought of as being integrated into this course when you signed up, or maybe even something you may or may not have thought of on your first reflection assignment when we asked you, what do you think the meaning of sustainability is? What do you think of when you hear the word sustainability? And just to show of hands, how many people wrote about something religious in that reflection when you thought about sustainability? One? Yeah? One person. Awesome. Two, great. So aside from those two, you might be wondering why. Why are we talking about religion in terms of sustainability? And so today I'm going to try to explain why. And by doing that, we're going to sort of start with definitions of what religion is. There's a lot of definitions. There are various, many different kinds. A belief in God, worshiping something superhuman, something supernatural. But it can also mean just having a systematic belief or a set of a systematic belief with devotion. So in one of the third dictionary definitions of religion was even consumerism was the new religion. So it can be a variety of things. But what is almost more important, though, too, is what religion's purpose is. So you might think about, religion really tells us what's right and wrong in the earth. It guides us, and it gives us a belief system. It tells us what our actions, our personal attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors should be while we're here on earth. And this is institutionalized, so this is very widespread, and religion actually is, most of the world practices some form of religion, or if you're not religious, you have some set of belief systems that you go by. Did I just get quiet? So clearly, especially with this one definition, that is a personal set of institutionalized systems of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices, you can see how this would be important to sustainability, what we think about the world, how we're going to live our lives, what kind of behaviors we have. And so, in terms of the three areas of sustainability that you've been introduced to in this class, we're going to focus on one predominantly, but just to explore the other two briefly, how the economic relationship between sustainability and religion might be played out is compelling and interesting, and actually might relate to some of you who are in the UCI Sustainability Endowment Group for your final projects. How do institutions, where do they put their money? Are they funding sustainability programs, social programs, or is it just in things that make money to help their endowments? And so that's one interesting economic relationship between sustainability and religion. But and I put a big check mark next to the social bubble, because while we can debate whether religion has been socially beneficial or not, in general, the public narrative is, religion tries to promote better society. Help your brother, help your neighbor, be charitable. So they're kind of on it, so to speak, in terms of the social aspects of sustainability in some senses. And we're soon going to learn as we go that some religious leaders, are realizing that the social and the environmental aspects of sustainability actually overlap quite a bit. And so this third, where the big arrow is what we're going to focus on today, the environmental aspects of how sustainability and religion overlap. And so before I move on, I just wanted to pose the question for you to think about throughout this lecture that was actually posed by the scholar Gary Gardner, about whether you think we need religion, or sustainability needs religion, to move to the next level. Sustainability has a lot of ambitious goals, and without this gigantic institution that really is important to many of us in our lives, are we going to be able to achieve some of these next steps? And vice versa for religion. Religion has a lot of core principles and beliefs that they would like to stay consistent with. And so will religion be integrating sustainability into what they believe is their core mission of helping people and caring for God's creations? Can we do this? Can they do this without each other? But as you might have read in the abstract for this presentation, the public narrative kind of might not be leading us to think that the two are very compatible, religion and sustainability. At the societal level, religion or theism which is measured sometimes by church attendance or belief in a God, is in decline in Europe. And secularism, sort of being non-religious and non-practicing, is on the rise. And in the United States, secularism is also on the rise, as is evangelism. But on the whole, we sort of see a picture of people believing less, and especially in Europe. This is written all over New York Times and Washington Post articles. Europe is becoming morally relativist. And yet the European Union has really strong environmental policies, very stringent environmental policies. So what might that lead you to believe as a public narrative? That the less religious enact more strict environmental policies? Is that what we should be aiming for? Why are the two not going together? Why are they not working together? Are they maybe, if they're focused less on the godly and the worldly issues, are they coming down to the earth more and thinking more scientifically and realistically? Just a question. Another area where sustainability and religion might have some mixed pictures about how compatible they are. I know this is beginning to sound like a dating show. It's not. Is on the individual level. So in some individual level values, we see that self-enhancement and traditional values, so caring about yourself, just focusing on getting, improving yourself, being ambitious in life, and having traditional values, caring about your family, security, safety, negatively predicts environmental concern and environmental behavior. Some studies find. Additionally, literal beliefs in the Bible, so believing that everything that is written in the Bible is fundamentally true. It was written by God. God put it there, and everything that it says is how I should live my life, literally. No interpretation, no changing with culture. It's very literal, and this negatively predicts environmental behavior too. On the other hand, we see the opposite of self-enhancement, self-transcendence, sense of spirituality. Positively, in psychology studies, is found to predict environmental concern and behavior. And alternatively to the literal beliefs in the Bible, well, actually not alternatively, but just seeing God as benevolent and having some other general religious measures such as Christian identity, church attendance. Some people have actually found in some samples that positively predicts environmental concern and behavior. So we're getting a kind of mixed picture. And some of this might depend on the values that are promoted in the religion itself. So, we'll talk more about this later, but when somebody promotes the idea of sanctification of nature, that nature is sacred because God created it, this positively predicts environmental behavior. In addition, stewardship, protecting nature because God created it in addition to humans, human and non-human things, positively predicts environmental behavior. And a recent data set that I was privy to found these trends, which I found compelling and also reflective of a public narrative. So a lot of people, especially in this growing secular world, say, "Oh, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual," and that's I'm doing nothing against that at all. But so we see that being spiritual actually has a positive trend with being connected to nature, whereas being religious has a negative trend. But it seems that these two things should be more compatible. But obviously, the religious should be quite spiritual people, and spiritual people being connected to nature is compelling. But I just think that there should be a bit more of a connection here, and we'll talk about that more later. So, in the end, while we see some of these negative trends in the public narrative, in the end, religion and sustainability really, at least on the social level, should appear to be quite compatible. We look to so many other institutions, massive institutions, internationally and nationally and locally, to help solve the issue of sustainability, such as our government, creating environmental policies. We think they're going to have a big impact on people because a lot of people listen to laws. We have businesses. Green business is a huge movement right now. How are you going to change your workers? How are you going to change your production cycles? And lots of literature says these social contexts and social networks promote environmental behavior and environmental attitudes. So religion is also a major institution with a big impact on the world, which a lot of people are privy to. And so why aren't we integrating religion in the public narrative? And I know that a lot of religions are doing this, but why isn't this matching up as much as it should be? So here we have the globe, or a map of the globe. And this is just sort of a variety of religions that are in our world. We see quite a diversity, and sometimes they're blocked out as sort of the Japanese complexes of Shintoism and Buddhism. And you can even see potentially some places where Professor Massey has talked about his, in his landscapes, such as Sierra Leone, which is a predominantly Islamic nation. And, you know, just thinking about that, you know, how could that have helped potentially, or maybe it did help them in the convincing the people of Sierra Leone how to care about their natural resources in a certain way, or was it already influencing it? And so of all the religions that are out there today, we're going to speak about a few big ones, a few small ones, a few old ones, and a few new ones. And some of them you might recognize clearly as, oh, this is a religion, and some of them you might not recognize as a religion. And so I'm just going to sort of define religion at the outset by, which is, as William James, a famous psychologist, one of the first psychologists, stated it. So religion shall mean for us the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual, people, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. So it's a pretty broad definition, and so I just wanted to put that out there. We're going to be talking about some things that are quite clearly religious and other things you might not assume. And each of these religions definitely has a different perspective, I think, on sustainability and how it can be integrated. And so it won't be entirely consistent about how each of them are described, but as they each have a unique viewpoint. But in the end, we'll come back and talk about some of the major concepts that really could be leveraged, could be integrated with sustainability and vice versa. So here, we are going to talk about the religions that we're going to discuss today are kind of going to be presented on a semi-historical timeline, not entirely, because just for the flow of the presentation didn't work out perfectly. But we will first be talking about animism, which is generally an ancient and polytheistic religion, which means that they believe in more than one god. And we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more. A lot of native and indigenous religions are animistic. Shintoism and the Druids in Northwest Europe. And then next we'll talk about Buddhism and sort of the circularity versus linearity of Buddhism versus other religions. And then following that we'll talk about the three big monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the different denominations and forms of Judaism and Christianity. And then finally we'll talk about sort of some other religions and some more recent ideas such as transcendentalism, movement in America, mysticism, and sort of this concept of healthy-mindedness or optimism that was also in the American narrative. So beginning with animism, 5000 BC. Animism is basically based on, and the reason I'm sort of broadly giving this to you is because there are many indigenous native religions, and I wanted to encapsulate them all in sort of a larger concept with them all. But a variety of them in a larger idea that the belief that non-human entities are spiritual beings. So they believe that humans and non-human entities are spiritual beings, or at least embody some kind of life principle. So since God is in all of nature, it's literally these non-human things have a spirit, have a soul, and they are worshipped, and there's a polytheistic religion. There's multiple, the sun and the moon, a lot of different religions, which we'll talk about next, are worship different parts of nature. And if God and nature are equal, it follows then that if you harm nature, you're harming the divine, you're harming God. So there's really no separation between the physical and the spiritual worlds. As I said, the soul and spirit exist not only in humans, but in everything, including natural phenomena. So just three examples of animistic religions are Shintoism, some Native American religions, and the Druids. So Shintoism is actually the second largest religion in Japan. And so the Shinto kind of focus on this idea of the kami, which is now known as spirituality. And it's the belief that there are sacred spirits in everything. So again, an animistic religion. And these are embodied in the wind and the trees and the rivers. And they live in harmony with respect and service to others and anything in the world. And they sort of consider, God being Mother Earth. And Shintoism has no founder, no scriptures. It is an indigenous in nature and only sort of provides, guidelines for life. But believes that every single, every non-human thing has a spirituality. Similarly, Native American religions, some of them are polytheistic, and there's a sort of belief in nature spirits and myths to explain human creation. And it's broadly, again, I'm not talking about any specific religion, just that the belief that humans and nature are bound together, and that there is a continuity between the past and the present. So things the cycles of life are worshipped and respected. They tended to worship a lot of the rotating seasons, the sun and the moon and the stars, all reflecting the one great spirit. So for instance, the Incas in Peru in the 15th and 16th century believed that the sun was the father, the moon was the mother, and they tended to practice their worship near mountains and rivers. The Druids in 1000 BC were an indigenous religion, and they also worshipped the changing seasons, the Earth Mother Goddess. Their places of worship are also near rocks and rivers. And here's a picture of Stonehenge where, over the years, different tribes of Druids buried the dead and sort of recognized the transition from life into death, acknowledging this ritual of the cycles of life, from life into death. And so they would go to Stonehenge. It was built around 2800 BC. And there's a sort of circular formation of rocks, and this is where they commemorated the passing from life to death. Next, we're going to talk about Buddhism. So similar, there's a little bit of overlap here between animistic religions to some extent. So sort of emphasis on the circularity of life and the cycles of life is huge in Buddhism. Siddhartha was born in 560 BC, and he was searching for an outlet of for human suffering. Why are humans suffering? And found that the answer was a balance between self-destruction and self-indulgence. So at the core of Buddhism, they believe that all human suffering is based on unhealthy attachments to material things. So unhealthy attachments to physical life, or unhealthy attachments to things in life too. It doesn't always have to be physical, but that is one of the main things about unhealthy attachments to material things. And this causes the root of all suffering. And then once you release yourself from the material world and the concerns with yourself, you might be able to achieve enlightenment. So through the practice of meditation, you try to get to, oh, sorry, it's cut off there. You reach a level where you're accepting compassion, and this training in meditation will help you achieve this. And so once you achieve this, your sense of compassion and you're really releasing yourself from unhealthy attachments leads you to see the interconnections of life. And so there's no way that you could harm or hurt nature, because it would mean harming and hurting the self. So now we're going to move into the big three monotheisms. As you all read a few weeks ago in the White Essay, there's a very strong narrative in the public discourse and more specifically in the environmental movement, that particularly Western religions, such as the Judeo-Christian perspective on religion, has not been so great for sustainability. Hasn't really led us right down the right path, and that they're not quite compatible. And some examples from her essay we have here is that God created man, and man named all the animals, thus establishing his dominance over them. And he writes again, God planned all of this explicitly for man's benefit. No single item of physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purpose. So this sort of anthropocentric perspective on sustainability is what we're seeing. And that man can exploit nature for his proper ends. And some of the things that Christianity, examples she gives, is that when Christianity first came around, they would go around destroying sort of idolatrous areas where animistic religious people would be worshiping. So they were cutting down their trees and wanting to use nature, and also wanting to convert these people, get them out of their animistic lifestyles. And other scholars talk about how the Christians really saw nature as profane and somewhat disgusting. And so this is, again, sort of part of the common narrative. And this kind of idea was also reflected in Locke's chapter on property, which interprets the sort of idea of be fruitful and multiply in the Bible. The idea that we have to be fruitful and multiply as commanding us to transform nature into something more fruitful. So it was literally our obligation to go out, go into the world, and say, why is this land not being used? It's time to use it. I'll show you how to use it. No, you haven't heard about the gospel yet. Let me show you about the gospel. We need to move away from these animistic traditions. our obligation is to use this land to be fruitful and multiply. And so, and this is partly how we see people today who work in nature, and in nature. Farmers or timber loggers, we say, as Professor Matthews said, they're doing God's work to some extent. And so while some of these things, are clearly very anthropocentric, right, in their nature, going away and cutting trees down for people who are worshiping them, it's also important for us to remember that there could be an opposite point of view here, which is what is being promoted, in a lot of narratives about biocentric or ecocentric perspectives as replacing the anthropocentric perspective on religion. And while this isn't a compelling argument, and it has a lot of validity to it. One scholar, Luke Ferry, wrote a book called The New Ecological Order, where he states that we really need to think a little harder about this. Maybe we shouldn't jump to the other end so fast, go entirely bio-ecocentric. Because really, humans were given the capacity to reason. Humans might be a little different than their non-human counterparts, all, again, created, by, if you believe in one God, and by a God. And so we don't want to be totally anti-humanist. Humans have the ability to have compassion, like we just talked about in the Buddhist religions. They have the capacity to be creative and be entrepreneurs. And so, perhaps jumping to the other end of the spectrum might not lead us down the absolute right path, but it is still a compelling one, says Ferry. So, following the next major monotheism, so that's sort of the history of the Judeo-Christian perspective here that we just talked about, the dominion over nature. And so Judaism is the first of the monotheisms. It started the Torah became the basis of Judaism in 500 BC. And we're going to sort of talk about some of the laws and readings and scriptures in the Torah and how they relate to sustainability, and how some of their practices historically and practices today really might lend themselves to a sustainable lifestyle. And so Judaism is sort of a religion that was based on prophets that continues into Christianity and also into Islam. It started with Abraham, and then Moses, who is their greatest prophet and is said to have authored the Torah. And it also is very dissimilar from Christianity, or not all Christian religions, but especially Catholicism. Authority on what is right and wrong doesn't lay with one person, such as the Pope. So it sort of is more interpreted by rabbis and scholars of the Torah, and they sort of, translate that into the different forms of Judaism that they sort of are aligned with. So there's three sort of areas of Judaism here. We have the Orthodox tradition in Judaism is the oldest form of Judaism, and it maintains the Torah and the Jewish law should be maintained strictly because they're divine in origin. That Moses wrote the Torah and that this is an unchangeable and divinely revealed document. And it places a high importance on a variety of principles, one of which is, which defines the Jewish faith, is that God is one, and that God is a spiritual, not a corporal or sort of physical in nature. And we also see in a bit how some of the practices of modern Orthodox Judaism, as I was mentioning, can be one of a really clear overlap with sustainability. On the other end of the spectrum is Reform Judaism. So a Reform position would be that Jewish law should be viewed as a set of general guidelines, rather than a set of restrictions and obligations where observance is required. They're often considered to be much more liberal and progressive in their ideas, and so they're sort of in the opposite end of Orthodox Judaism. And then in the middle we have the conservative Judaism, or Masorti, which is what they're called outside of the United States and Canada. And while they are more traditional than Reform Judaism, they're still committed to traditional Jewish laws and customs and are deliberately non-fundamentalist, so they don't believe in the sort of literal translation of the Torah. But they have a positive attitude towards modern culture, unlike Orthodox Judaism. They don't see Jewish laws as static. So while there are some differences within the Jewish traditions, we're going to sort of broadly talk about some laws and readings from the Torah and values from these laws and practices that relate across boundaries. So here are a few of them. The halakha laws are really what a lot of the Jewish scholars in the environmental movement consider to be primary reasons for ecological concerns. And it discusses sort of the biblical protection for fruit trees, and this has been extended as a law to include harm against a lot of areas in the public domain. And this, I honestly, these laws and readings, I think, relate a lot to what you read last week about Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. We were talking about the shared areas, shared public domain things, and I think it sort of speaks to that to some extent. Second, the mitzvah law is, which means do not destroy, is expanded in modern day to include the destruction of household goods, clothing, buildings, and not just wasting anything, not being over-consuming and wasting things. And then finally we have this sort of commitment to the common good, which is what I was just talking about. So there's this tale of a man who is shooting arrows, and he's in his backyard, and he's standing there and he's shooting arrows up into the air and saying, oh, I don't know, I didn't mean to hurt anybody, I didn't mean to cause any harm, I was just shooting arrows for fun, it doesn't mean anything, don't worry about it. But how might this be translated into a modern environmental law? And what it has been is that there's a ban on polluting workshops in a courtyard where other people are living. So having a workshop in the middle of a shared space where that causes pollution is not allowed. And so and this is based on this idea that you can't just sit in your backyard and shoot arrows and assume nothing's going to happen to another person or your neighbor. And here we have some sort of values that also can be pulled out from some of these readings. Responsibility, humility, moderation on the left here. And this one we'll see a lot, this sort of responsibility ethic. And literally though, in Hebrew, some of these words are really interesting. So while we did talk about how the Judeo-Christian perspective promotes the sort of narrative of that man has dominion over nature, some words that come right after this, which is the Lord took man and put him on earth and put him in the Garden of Eden to till and to keep it. In Hebrew, these words for to till and to keep mean to serve and to be a steward or trustee of the land. And so you can see that there's a sense of responsibility that is inherent in the language used here. Similarly, as man has recognized his humility in relation to the rest of nature. So that since we are first in the order of creation, non-human things were created after us, we have to look after the creations. These are two quotes from different rabbis in very different decades and eras. They talk about the sort of equal importance of the earth, the humans, and the rain, and how we can't have one without the other. The earth needs the rain, and we need the rain to live. The humans can't exist without this relationship, this interdependence. Moderation is another concept that we'll see throughout different religions. Who is rich? One is who is happy with his portion, it says. And then on the right side, we have here sort of two ethical obligations that some laws in Judaism sort of promote into values. So there's a horizontal obligation, which is what everything on earth, right now, basically, what's happening right now, and our obligation to be living equitably within Earth's boundaries. And this is kind of evidenced by the land covenant, which is a very strong value in the Jewish tradition, where God is basically a covenant between man and God, that God created the earth and the life upon it so we can live on earth. And we must leave it in the state that it was in. So this is a strong understanding that we are giving you this earth to live on, and you should be treating it well. So if you are loyal to God, your land will become fertile, and you will feel gratitude towards God. And the second one for the horizontal obligation is another one that we're going to see in the next two monotheistic religions as well. So creation was deemed good by God. This is a positive. Once God created man, He created man, and then He created the non-human creatures, and He said, this is good. And if God is delighting in all of the things that He created, then we should be treating that which He created with delight and concern as well. One I thought pretty unique and interesting aspect of the Jewish tradition was this vertical ethical obligation that one scholar put out there, sort of thinking about the future. So there's a strong narrative in the Torah about cross-generational responsibilities emphasized. The sins of one generation can hurt future ones, and that includes human and non-human life. Finally, practices in Judaism we have some overlaps with sustainability as well. prayer. Again, you'll see this in many different religions. But it can help us contemplate the world, see our place in the world, and feel our part of the larger creation. Might lead us to feel more gratitude and have a higher value for the things on earth. Historically, in Israel, there was a law that every 7 years, people were required to leave the land alone, not cultivate it that year. You don't touch it for this entire year. And any of the whatever food happened to grow in it that year was also required to have shared with the poor. And this was clearly sort of overlap of a social and environmental aspect of sustainability. We're renewing the land, and we're sharing whatever is grown on that land with people that are less fortunate. And the third practice, Shabbat, some of you are probably familiar with. 1 out of every 7 days, people who are in the definitely in all three forms of Judaism, but definitely in Orthodox Judaism, at sundown on Friday night, are not allowed to use electricity, have to walk to everything, and it's a day of rest and contemplation. Spiritual contemplation are the only things allowed. So it commemorates God's day, the day that after God created everything, and he looked back and he rested and looked in awe at what he had created. And so this, forbidding all activity that relates to electricity, it would be pretty sustainable in lots of ways. And this, especially if this is required by your religion, of course you are going to follow this practice. And finally, the sort of modern interpretation of an ancient, sort of older minor event in the Jewish calendar has been brought up again. Was sort of in the beginning, it was to Shabbat was when fruit trees became subject to what you paid for your religion, your tithing. So if you had fruit trees, that was part of what you had to pay to your religion weekly, or I don't know if it was weekly, but based on how much money you had or what you had, on what resources you had. And now this is sort of seen as a New Year's for the trees, in the 20th century, sort of Arbor Day in Judaism. So somehow I just feel like I want to ask you guys if you have any questions, because I'm going, throwing a lot at you. Before I dive in. Yeah?
What was that last thing you explained?
The Arbor Day thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in a lot of religions, it sort of started with if you had resources. So you have to pay a tithing for, if you're in a lot of religions, so you have to pay a portion of your income in modern day. But in ancient times, when you might not have had money to pay, the trees that you had on your land were part of your tithing. They were incorporated into what you owed your religion, sort of money, But now this is very much reinterpreted now into a sort of day of an Arbor Day, sort of a celebration of trees in the Jewish religion, in some parts of the Jewish religion. Any other questions? Okay. So the second monotheism. So in 104 BC, Jesus was born. And as we were talking about with Judaism, we were relying on sort of readings from the Torah, and now we're going to be talking about the Bible. By 313 AD, after the death of Jesus, the religion was spread much further than it had been before, because Constantine, the emperor of Rome, converted to Christianity. And so, not to be too controversial, we are starting with Catholicism. But this is sort of reflective somewhat of what we were talking about with the white essay. So, in the beginning, Christians were trying to move the people who were animistic away from their animistic religions. And recently, this is a very public narrative. We're going to get into the but after this. But the Vatican thought Avatar was a great movie. It was very entertaining. But, we can't, Vatican Radio said, we can't have this, equating human beings with all other living things in the name of an egalitarian vision. We don't want a sort of neo-paganism to be the religion of the millennium, because Avatar was such a profound movie, and this is part of what they interpreted as its message, that, the spirits, there's spiritual things, there's something animistic about, and spiritual about all non-human things, human and non-human. And so, while this was true, recently, and which we're going to go into next, the Pope, it was kind of recently in 1990, Pope John Paul II took quite bold stand on the issue of climate change and ecological issues that was very compelling, and sort of that we, need to face up to the consequences of what we're doing to the world. So this is what we're mostly going to be focusing on as pulling from for evidence of the overlaps between Catholicism and ecology or sustainability. So similar to Judaism and similar to a few other religions we're talking about, there was a sort of distinct, actually, in Catholicism they pointed out this sort of distinct issue from when, so God created man and then God created all non-human things. And when he created all non-human things, he looked at everything together and then he changed the word from it was good to it was very good. So this is very good. So even acknowledging even more, he knew he added something and that this was special. And so we have to care for this thing that God created. And again, similar, but maybe with a bit more fiery rhetoric here. Adam and Eve, they're made to look over the Garden of Eden, but as the Pope mentions is in one of his speeches, they went against the plan of God, and they sinned. And as a result, by going against the Creator's plan, the land mourned, and all who dwelled within it were in languish. The beasts in the fields and the birds of the air, and even the fish of the sea were taken away. And so there's a very close link between the behavior and following God's will and God's plan and the health of the earth to some extent. So in here we see then the death and resurrection of Christ, that God the Father was pleased to reconcile himself with all things, it says, whether on heaven or on earth, making peace by bringing Jesus down to earth and having him die and resurrect. And so the Pope says, if we are not at peace with God, earth cannot be at peace. And this was a bit more of the exciting, bold things that I thought were interesting. And so what I keep referencing is actually what Pope John Paul II spoke to the UN in 1990, and he said, the title of this document was called The Ecological Crisis, A Common Responsibility. And he talks about the reasons why we're in an ecological crisis. What happened? How did we get here? And then the solutions, which I found very compelling. And so he notes, and some of these things you might recognize as a common narrative in the Catholic religion, but he doesn't say it in the way that you would expect. So sort of the indiscriminate application of advances in science and technology. But here he's talking about agriculture and the use of pesticides and letting industry run wild. He talks about the greenhouse effect and how it's damaging humans and the environment. He also talks about lack of respect for life, but he's talking about the pollution of affecting the dignity of workers and the exploitation of animals and plant life. And he says, we can't affect one part of the ecosystem without realizing that it's going to affect many other portions of it. Recognize the interdependence of these things on each other. And so the solutions that he offers up are that, when he was speaking to the United Nations, were, okay, we need to really work on this policy-wise, internationally, and also on a local level. But what I mentioned in the beginning about sort of the overlap of the environmental and social aspects of sustainability, he says, we need to care for the poor. This is one of our the main parts of our religion. And the impoverished are disproportionately affected by climate change. So this is for this reason alone, it should be a core issue for us. But he does, as I said, acknowledge many of the other issues of climate change. One of the solutions he offers up is ending war. The damage to the environment, as you've seen in many of the landscapes Professor Matthew has shown, is catastrophic. And he also mentions changing our lifestyles, that we're over-consuming, we're too materialistic, we have to use less energy. And he also speaks about education about climate change and valuing nature for its aesthetic and restorative power. And so there's a video, actually, which I think was really, really interesting, that the Climate Covenant, Catholic Climate Covenant, put together.
We will be judged by how we treat the least among us.
Just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.
I think it started
As
halfway
Catholics,
through. Sorry.
we have a moral.
There we go.
Who's under your carbon footprint? Using too much energy, driving bigger cars, heating bigger houses, using more hot water. It all means more greenhouse gases and a bigger carbon footprint. And that means adding to the problem of climate change. More heat, more droughts, more floods, more storms, more joblessness. So who's getting stepped on? Who is under your carbon footprint?
It is the poor who most directly bear the brunt of environmental degradation.
And the longer we wait to curb our use of fossil fuels, our footprint gets a little heavier and a little deeper.
Coming changes will affect all aspects of the environment, especially for the poor and the vulnerable.
When we demand bigger, better, and more, the world's vulnerable get poorer, hungrier, and less.
Environmental degradation makes the life of the poor especially unbearable.
In Scripture, Matthew reminds us that ultimately we will be judged by how we treat the least among us.
Just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.
As Catholics, we have a moral obligation to care for the poor and the most vulnerable. But today, too often, we are wasting God's gifts, abusing the planet, changing the climate, and leaving too many with too little for full human development.
There is new and stronger evidence that most of the warming over the last 50 years is attributed to human activities.
Now, prudence demands action.
Inaction and inadequate responses will likely place even greater burdens on poor peoples.
As Catholics, in the face of climate change, we can recommit to what we already do well by reaching out to the most vulnerable here and around the world, by renewing our Catholic commitment to care for God's creation, by living our faith, by treading more lightly, and acting more boldly. We can care for creation and the poor, as St. Francis reminds us.
Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us.
As Catholics, we can live.
So you get the point, right? So they are integrating this quite deeply into their doctrine. The creation care idea, that God created all of these things and therefore we have to care for them. And we are charitable people, we care for the poor, and the poor are disproportionately affected. They even have something on there that says, take the St. Francis pledge. That's pretty interesting. So again, as they were concluding with there, and as White concludes with in his essay, maybe we can look to some other aspects in Catholicism and other religions that will lead us towards not seeing man as a limitless rule over creation, but as equal and a steward of nature. And so White proposes St. Francis as the patron saint for ecologists. Any questions on that? Okay. So while we are going slightly out of historical order here, I was just pushing all of wanted to put all the Christian religions in one area. So now moving on to Protestantism, just particularly because Protestantism was actually a rebellion against the medieval Christian church, which was predominantly the Catholic Church. As many of you probably learned in your high school classes, Henry VIII split off from the Catholic Church to create the Church of England. And there's two areas of Protestantism that we're going to sort of be discussing as distinct. The mainline Protestantism, what some people call, and non-mainline. And so mainline Protestantism came sort of from Luther and the Luther ethic and Calvinistic movements. Martin Luther in 1517 started speaking out against the Catholic Church on such thing as indulgences, that you could, pay for your sins and pay to be forgiven for your sins. And the offsprings of his movements were, the Anglican Church, the modern Anglican Church, and the Episcopalian churches. But by 1536, John Calvin was thinking similar things and led to what was called the Reformation, which was, again, reacting strongly to the sort of potentially, very physically based, idolatrous, what they believe was idolatrous Catholic behaviors. So if you've ever gone into a Protestant church and a Catholic church, you can see quite clearly what the differences are. And so, there's not the cross isn't everywhere, and Jesus isn't, it's just a lot of things that we aren't putting God we aren't creating idols out of spiritual beings. And so while the Anglican and Episcopalian churches have very similar rituals to Catholicism, they also believe they have a direct relationship to God. There's no intermediary needed, like priests and the sort of hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And Calvinism believes similar things. And some forms of Calvinism believes in sort of this idea of predestination, that while you're on earth, you don't God has a plan for you to either go to heaven or not. And so, but you won't know that. You don't know where you're going to be going. So just to be living your life with a good work ethic and to be prosperous while you're here is your purpose. So it's known to be a sort of living a lean lifestyle and helping the poor and emphasize hard work. So the other area of Protestantism is non-mainline, and we'll mostly be talking about sort of some modern evangelical routes in relation to sustainability and climate change. So some of the themes of mainline Protestantism are what they're commonly thought of in sort of the public narrative, are very progressive on social issues, very pro-science in a lot of ways. In the 1950s, the National Council of Churches, which was the primary Protestant organization, was considered very liberal. And again, they have a sort of emphasis on doing good works, volunteering, community-based action, and working hard. And so some of the more value-based areas in Protestantism that tend to overlap, we can see some overlap with sustainability, are sort of that we're all, on Earth. We're believed to live in a sort of depraved world. We're kind of uncontrollable sinners that need to restrict ourselves and restrain ourselves and follow the Word of God and talk to God and ask for forgiveness. And so similar sort of the environmental narrative to some extent, that we are, as people, are sort of uncontrollable polluters, that we can't control our behaviors and our actions. So it's kind of a pessimistic worldview to some extent, sort of in the public narrative. And that Protestantism is also very morally rigorous religion. So consistency is highly valued. That, if something is wrong, you don't do it. There's no sort of easy route to forgiveness. The relationship between your deeds and your beliefs should be completely in line. And so this sort of, you might interpret this in some ways to sort of what you've heard about the early Quakers in America, the Puritans. The slightest inconsistency between maybe even their profession and a deed would lead them to protest, because they so believed in that consistency between what your beliefs and your actions were. Another sort of value that we can look at too in Protestant religions is the focus on the asceticism. So it's sort of the lack of not being overly indulgent, and it's sort of depriving yourself of certain things in order to achieve greater spiritual levels. And the reason why this is more of a focus, again, goes back to the historical narrative of the reaction against the sort of gratification behavior of the medieval church. No indulgences and excessive consumption. And so, should I say anything there? Oh, yes. Evangelism, sort of non-mainline Protestantism. There's a strong growth, like I was saying in the beginning of the lecture, of evangelism in the United States, and also a clear decline of mainline Protestant religions in the United States. Historically, this sort of Protestant Christian movement sort of began in the Great Britain in the 1730s and then gained popularity in the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States. And the key components of evangelism are sort of this idea of being born again, of having a personal conversion, having a high regard for Bible authority, so a literal translation of the Bible. An emphasis on saving on the death and resurrection of Jesus, and then actively sharing the gospel with anybody that you can talk to. Sort of, trying to find converts in life actively. And while many people, this sort of, in America, this has been associated with a kind of anti-scientific narrative that, of some of the polls about climate change beliefs and religions, we see that evangelists tend to have the lowest belief in climate change compared to other religions. And yet, we see that many of their leaders these days are confronting the issue of climate change. So in 2006, 86 U.S. evangelical Christian leaders launched the Evangelical Climate Initiative, calling on all Christians to support federal legislation to reduce carbon dioxide and to stem global warming. And so while it's kind of, I hope you're getting this sort of narrative, while we do see that this, historically, we might have a, dominion narrative over nature, and there's many things in almost all of the religions that we can see that are pointing towards sustainability. even the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, Ted Haggard, states there's no doubt about it in my mind that climate change is happening and that there's no doubt that we would be wise to stop doing the foolish things that we're doing. So he recognizes the causes of, as being human, to some extent, some of the causes being human that could be causing this. And I just can't help but think, sort of on the, just to close out the evangelism note, how these people are, you know, how many people have been to an evangelical church? So I think their beliefs are so strong, and they're such passionate people. I can't, just to think in my head is like fireworks go off, what they could do for sustainability and what sustainability could do for them. It's a very powerful, powerful religion and movement. And finally, Mormonism. We're just going to briefly touch on this and sort of some of the readings in the Book of Mormon, just as we were talking about the readings in the Bible. So Mormonism is a very regional religion, and you know, just as you might have been seeing in the news lately, with Mitt Romney has some opinions on climate change that are consistent, some that aren't. And so I think it's important to talk though about how this religion, which is growing in America and is a fundamentally American religion, some of their scriptures might overlap in some extremely unique ways with sustainability. So again, the same thing with the dressing and keeping the garden, Adam and Eve, to dress it and keep it and to take care of it and be happy in it. But it's similar to sort of the Catholic narrative, that, or not similar to that, but man's relationship with earth, that you're given, you know, man is given earth for the use and benefit of man, to please the eye and glad in the heart. But earth isn't just some endless resource. It says that earth may be used with judgment, not to access, and neither by extortion. And this is in the Book of Mormon. So to be wise and not to use it excessively. And finally, the sort of one interesting point that I think is unique to the Mormon scriptures is the idea of food and conspiracy. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard the rules of the Mormon Church about only eating and drinking certain things. But this passage in the Book of Mormon can be interpreted as a protection of people against bad substances, unsafe food, given to you by conspiring men. So the Revelation speaks of evil and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days. And then it lists a series of prohibitions, so alcohol, coffee, and tobacco. But it also lists things that we should eat. And so conspiring men, which could include farmers using pesticides, industries promoting irresponsibly harvested meats and foods, in the end can damage the person and the environment where they were responsibly harvested from. So you can potentially extend this scripture in the Book of Mormon to say that, you know, maybe you can't always trust where your food comes from, and you should be thinking a bit more about what's in it and how it's going to affect your health and other people's health and the health of the land. So, clicker question. And I'm only doing this because of Mitt Romney. Since it has to be fresh on our minds. Okay, 5 more seconds? 10 more seconds? 10 more seconds? So you would most likely vote for a presidential candidate based on commitment to sustainability. 128 of you said that. And 60 said both. And 19 said expression of faith. How do I get out of it? Thanks. So, just a piece of information. thought it might be interesting to ask that question. So now we are going to move in to the third monotheism. And to be clear, obviously I think most of you know this, but I was putting Protestantism after Catholicism simply because it was all Christian religions. But Islam is, again, like I was saying, the third major religion. It came directly after the beginnings of Christianity. In 570 AD is when the Prophet Muhammad was born. After having visions in 610 AD, he sort of became the primary prophet of Islam. And so, in general, Islam is kind of interesting because at its core, it has the concept of compassion in a lot of the chapters of the Quran. Every single chapter, in fact, begins with the words in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. And Muhammad, who is the last amongst a series of prophets of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, was told that we have not sent you here except as a source of compassion. And so this idea of compassion, which we spoke about a little bit in Buddhist religion, is quite core to their beliefs. And the two areas similar to we were pulling from the Book of Mormon, the Bible, the Torah, we're going to be pulling our sort of knowledge from is the Quran and Sunnah, which are the actions, sayings, and habits and approvals by the Prophet. And so we see numerous verses in the Quran talk about the environment and the importance of reflection upon creation. So, the sun, the moon, the stars, reflecting on what glorifies God. And sort of broadly, the environment in Islam, in the Quran, talks about they have a sort of warning against destroying the environment and rewarding for caring it. So similar to what we were a little bit with the Catholic thing, if we turn our Adam and Eve turning themselves against the Garden of Eden, then earth will suffer. Here we have, and when man turns his back, he hastens about the earth to do corruption there and to destroy the tillage and the stock. And God loves not corruption. And then rewarding for caring for the environment, we have the Prophet Muhammad said, whoever plants a tree and looks after it with care until it matures and becomes productive will be rewarded in the hereafter. So you will be rewarded for planting trees and looking after it and caring for it. And in the service of every living thing, every living being, there is a reward. So if every living being means human and non-human things. And interesting, sort of unique to, at least with what I've been studying, unique to the Islamic perspective is sort of this relationship with science. And while we're not going to sort of dive into, that's a whole other lecture that we could talk about religion, sustainability, and science, which is sort of inevitably going to creep in here and there as climate change is a scientific reality. The history of religion and science is thus is too much for this lecture. Is basically what I'm saying. So in Islam, there's a belief basically in two sort of things. That nature and earth are always in harmony. And so since the earth was created to work so perfectly, the earth is created to be unified and so interdependent, the sun and the moon move and they have their rotations, they don't smash into each other, everything is synchronized and works out just so. And two, that man was given a mind to understand such things, that he might be able to understand these things that are happening on earth. That as humans, we're meant to investigate it, we're meant to be curious, we're meant to understand such things. We're meant to be scientific in some ways, that we're looking to the earth and trying to understand it, this thing that works so beautifully that was created by God. And one example of this is on the Quran when it speaks of the seas and the rivers. So here it says, he has set free the sea. He has set free the two seas meeting together. There is a barrier between them. They do not transgress. And so even though this was way before any knowledge of, or any knowledge that we would know of, that of the sort of what an estuary was, the area between salt water and fresh water. And yet this is discussed in the Quran as something, as a scientific reality, or says as it's interpreted in some ways as miraculous in modern day because it would have been so difficult to have known this without advanced instruments. And so Then we also, now we're going to talk a little bit about water and readings from the Quran and animals. And so the Quran talks about water as a finite resource, and I think this is actually quite compelling. Have you ever, it says here, have you ever considered that if all the water you have disappears into the earth, who then could bring you clear flowing water? There's a story that the Prophet advised somebody once, one of his companions, who he saw bathing in a river. And even though the river was flowing over with water, he said, "You're using too much." So even if you're right next to it, bathing in a flowing river of water, you're not supposed to be using that much. Don't be excessive. This is a finite resource. Don't waste it. Muhammad himself was known to only bathe with the exact same amount of water every day. Or not every day. I made that up. But it's, Muhammad is himself known to only use a small amount of water when he bathed. The same exact amount, because it's hard to measure. Also, in the Quran, we see things about animal rights. That animals, you have to handle them with care. Forbids beating animals unnecessarily or branding them or allowing them to fight each other for human entertainment. One of the examples of this is the Prophet Muhammad saying that you can't sharpen, we also consider the psyche of the animal. Don't sharpen your blade in front of them, but be sure to sharpen it for an easy death. And don't ever do this in front of the sight of other animals. And similar to some Native American religion, it also has an implication that animals are meant to be used by humans, but only if you use them as fully as possible. So you never just sort of die in vain or based on games. Finally, we have sort of this idea of material and spiritual balance. As we've talked about in some of the other religions, if God created the 7 heavens and the earth and all that contains him glorifies him, nor is there anything that does not glorify him in praise, that you understand not their praise. So this is kind of speaking to people to recognize that everything on earth should be glorified because God created all of it. And again, similar to some of the other narratives we talked about, that some of your actions can affect the environmental outcomes. Yet, had the people of the cities believed and been God-fearing, we would have opened up them blessings from heaven and earth. But they cried lies, so he seized them for what they earned. So depending on your belief, number one, in God, and number two, that if you truly believe that God is going to ask you what you did on earth, then you would behave in a way that was consistent and good and truthful. And this leads to, as we've talked about a little bit before, a great consistency. Specifically, it reminds me a little bit of the morally rigorous Protestant religions, that your values and your beliefs and your actions should be right in line, which is quite beneficial when it comes to sustainability, because many of us have positive environmental attitudes, and oftentimes in the psychological research we see this doesn't translate to behavior. Okay, so finally, the last part, we're just going to talk about some more relatively recent religious ideas that some people have called optimism or healthy-mindedness, and also transcendentalism in the 19th century, and how this sort of related to the sort of mystical experiences in nature. So the religion of healthy-mindedness is characteristic of the 19th century. Its tendency to look at all things and see all things that are good. The sort of mantra that it seems to say is that God is well and so are you. So empowerment comes from being optimistic, and fear and egoism will lead to destruction. And so some people that were sort of big proponents of this or examples of this were, for example, Walt Whitman there in the corner. Somebody said of him that no man ever liked so many things and disliked so few as Walt Whitman. And so the sentiments that Walt Whitman expressed in his American literature were of an expansive order. So it kind of went from persuading the reader that all men, women, life and death, all things were divinely good. And this is kind of, somewhat in contrast to some of the other things that we've been hearing in other religions. That, the root of all human suffering, just a sort of the negative, heavy weight of some of the other religions that we talked about. And so some of the methods in these types of religious ideas are sort of meditation, mindfulness, sort of hypnotic practice to achieve a sort of state of union between yourself and the natural world. And so sort of within the transcendentalist model, these folks up here were kind of the beginning, many of them believe to be the sort of beginnings of the American environmental movement. So this is John Muir and President Roosevelt on one of the many excursions that they took together. They would often camp together and talk about their connections, or not talk about their connections, but they would be in nature together for days at a time. And Muir often wrote a lot of America's founding environmental policies. And so part of what his belief in nature was is he did come from a Protestant family, but the sort of idea of transcendent or mystical experiences was very strong in his life. And there was a very strong overlap with how he felt about nature and his religious beliefs. He thought that forests were a temple and that nature was a window into heaven. And even, to such an extent that nothing in nature scared him. He somebody reported that he climbed one of the tallest trees in the forest during a gigantic thunderstorm just to see how it would feel to be a tree during a thunderstorm. So he had a very deep connection to nature and felt that there was a sort of spirituality in nature that he connected with. And similarly, sort of the transcendentalist movements, and they overlapped a little bit. They met a few times. We have Emerson and Thoreau, who are sort of some of and Margaret Fuller, who I should have put up there, are part of the American literature tradition. But they sort of created a movement called the Transcendentalist Movement that really emphasizes that we're all closely connected to God. Everything is divine, and this movement sort of championed the idea of the individual experience of the natural world as a primary means of achieving spiritual communion with God. And sort of it kind of goes from this idea that we will achieve union and we will achieve with the universe and the natural world by moving from a sort of seeing ourselves as unique and contracting, sort of the saying no and looking at the individual, to go into more expansive ideas and opening yourself up, and that you will achieve a sort of interconnection with nature and God that way. And so, we sort of think about, most commonly when we think about transcendentalism, we think about the literary movements and religious movements that came from them. The religious perspective on mysticism is very closely related. And there's a few quotes up there that I thought were very compelling. Somebody was writing about mysticism and who we should study when we're talking about mysticism. He says, these experiences we can only find in individuals for whom religion exists not as a dull habit, but an acute fever. So this is a very powerful, acute experience. And they carry with them a sort of sense of inner harmony and illumination. And they might not come very often, but they're often remembered for a long time. And so they sort of overlap a little bit with the sort of experiences in nature and also sort of mystical tradition in religions. You kind of look beyond yourself, you see beyond yourself. And a lot of people have mentioned this, kind of happen out of doors, you have a sense of mystery and eternity. And in my research specifically, I've looked at sort of two different kinds of transcendence. One is sort of focused on diminutive transcendence, where you feel you're standing and looking at that view or walking around a big spectacular piece of nature, and you feel small and you feel overwhelmed and in awe of this beautiful thing, versus what other people experience. It's sort of more manicured gardens, walking through Aldrich Park, deep flow transcendence, where you're more relaxed and have a sense of flow. And in my research, and why I think this is important for sustainability, I can see that how these things, I found that these things are related to environmental behavior and environmental intentions, as have a few other people. So here we have sort of the various components of mysticism. There's a noetic quality, so you feel that you have a completely new or higher way of looking at the world. All things seem to be alive and aware. Everything seems to be awake, sort of. You have a sense of the divine. Everything feels like it's one. You kind of feel like you're part of something that's greater than you. And this experience is so powerful that it's actually difficult to talk about it. You can't put it into words. You feel like you might have gotten some insights into deeper truths. Oftentimes it's a rather transient experience, so you have a sort of sense of timelessness, but it might not occur for very long. and you sort of feel passive in the end. Even if you're trying to achieve it yourself through some kind of meditation or mindfulness, in the end you feel like you're kind of enwrapped in a larger thing, and you're passively accepting this larger experience. And so part of why I'm interested in this, and part of why I'm in part doing this lecture, is because, you know, I feel like have had an experience like this, and I think it's very important. It happened somewhat inadvertently. I actually grew up in, you know, sort of area of the country that was between the rural and the urban, and so very suburban, but leaning on the rural. So there's lots of empty farmland around, and I would just go out and just sit in the middle of this big empty field that used to grow corn, and I'd read, and I was just mostly trying to get out of the house. You know, I wasn't really after some kind of experience, but I would sit there, but after a few times of doing that, you know, the day would kind of slip away, and not necessarily on purpose. You sort of, it often wouldn't occur on that same day. Maybe a few days afterwards, I'd be driving, and I'd look at some, you know, like a cow or something, and you have a sense of overwhelming joy. You have a sense of a great appreciation for life. That all of these things, even the ugly things about the world, are all connected, and that there's something really truly special about this experience, and so that there's sort of beauty in everything. And so I'm sort of telling you this because I want to ask you if you think that you've had a mystical experience. Have you not been able to talk about something? We'll give you extra time if you want to think about it. Can't wait to get this answer. Better be honest, too. This isn't a normal I clicker question. Okay, I think that's it, right? Yeah. Go ahead. Release the answers. 136. Awesome. Now we have follow-up questions. Oh, yeah. Okay. Where were you? Do you think you were you in a natural environment? Were you in your home or in a building? At a place of worship? A place where you worship? That's the same one. Oh, I didn't put them all. Yeah. Sorry. You have to choose. This is good. Now I'm learning my assumptions. I should have put all of the above. We saw 214 last time. 214. That's fine. You can go. In nature, 126. 126 last time too. I wonder if those same 126s are there. No, maybe okay. Then 53 in the building. 22 at a place of worship. Oh, good. Oh, see, that you can put another. See, D or E or other. Yeah. Awesome. And last question, I promise. I'm just really curious. Were you alone or with other people? Alone is A. One other person is B. Two or more people is C. I promise this is not going to be used for research purposes. It's all anonymous. There's no more after this. So fast. That's a record. 28 seconds. 2:12.
I love this.
All right, that's good. No. It's having a hard time calibrating. Ah, how interesting. Well, what's happening? I think What? I think we're having some divine intervention, right? No, I don't know. Will there be do we have to restart it in order to get the answer? It's okay. It's okay. That's fine. I'm taking too long anyway, so. Okay, so the sort of outcomes of these experiences, people sort of say that you sort of feel more optimistic and more sense of oneness in the world. You go from feeling small to feeling vast. And even though we found this wonderful video to represent this, I'm worried I'm taking too much time to play it. Yeah, I'm taking too much time. So you should watch it. It's called From the Molecule to the Universe. It's fabulous.
Oh, that's so cool.
I know, yeah. Maybe we'll play it at the break. I'll play it at the break. Okay, so sort of the major concepts we talked about today that I think are critical to leveraging sustainability and religion incorporating sustainability and vice versa are, as we saw in the beginning, sort of sanctification and self-transcendence. If nature is good and God created nature and human and non-human things, then we should be taking care of it. As we just saw, the sort of mystical and transcendent experiences in nature can have a positive relationship with environmental behavior. And the ideas of moderation, compassion, and asceticism, sort of depriving the self of things in order, or just using things within the means that they're meant to be used, are all sort of concepts that we can leverage potentially in our practices, in our religious practices, and in our non-religious practices. Specifically, so. But I'm just going to go into a few of them a little more deeply, and then we'll be done. So compassion. Even though we talked about this as existing, having a strong narrative in a few of the religions we talked about, of Buddhism and Islam. Rousseau says that we as humans have the capacity to understand and the capacity to have compassion. Sort of the idea that maybe we shouldn't be all ecocentric. That we have these things as humans that allow us to make decisions, and we can either progress or go in the opposite direction and destroy based on our abilities. There's a really wonderful YouTube by Karen Armstrong, a lot of YouTube videos. She's quite famous for reviving the golden rule of compassion. That she says all the religions in the world have this idea, this positive idea that you always treat yourself as you want others to be treated, or don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. So you kind of dethrone yourself from the center of the universe, and this leads to sort of a greater belief and greater compassion for others. She thinks that without this revival of the golden rule, we might not have a viable world for the next generation. Similar, and this sort of relates to the idea of saintliness, of somebody sort of surrendering themselves to the will of God and surrendering yourself to compassion for all beings, and not thinking of yourself as Mother Teresa did. This is related. Asceticism is also related to these ideas. Sort of the belief that we have to confront the wrongness in the world, that we have to neutralize this through suffering, that the world is inherently has some issues, and so our lives that are based on having less are free, and then lives freer than lives based on either doing or being in the interest and the action of people. And this is sort of one of the core tenets of many religions that we talked about. So, and then William James, again, the sort of psychologist that we based our definition of religion off of today, said, think of the strength which personal indifference to poverty would give us. If we were devoted to unpopular causes, we would no longer need to worry about holding our tongues or fearing voting for a ticket or voting for a policy that was revolutionary or was pushing for reforms, if we weren't thinking about ourselves and what we needed. And so some final sort of ideas that I think are very compelling. Both are sort of what the focus of our religions. There a difference between an individual or a religion that focuses more on the afterlife and one who focuses more on earthly things. And really, I think there's a strong argument for both. If you really believe in heaven and you only are focusing on having a good life in the afterlife, and you believe that God will ask you what you did on this world while you were here, this would create a great amount of consistency in what your actions would be on earth. That you should be representing a very, very caring and following the rules of God. And so if you truly believe in the afterlife and then believe in heaven, you should be behaving in ways that we've talked about this whole lecture, that caring for God's creatures. And versus the other perspective, though, too, is that perhaps maybe some of these places on earth are keeping us more grounded. if we see Mecca up here, Stonehenge, the wall in Jerusalem, and the Vatican City. These are all places that are on our earth, and maybe visiting them or having them as big symbolic parts of our world is critical to keeping us grounded and being concerned about sustainability and earthly things. And similarly, sort of religions promote sort of rituals of life and death, rituals that allow us to remember to be good, and they'll allow us to remember that there's certain parts of life. So, you know, we have rites of passage. Okay, now you're at this point of your life. You're reminded of your age. You're reminded that now people die when you go to funerals, and there's mournings, and in a lot of the, which we didn't dive into very much, but in some of the readings from various religions, people really do reflect on looking at nature and how the earth nourishes nature, and also how things die. There's a cycles of life, and this is going to teach us more about being grounded in on our land, and that we only have a short period of time here, and if we take care of it, it can last. And so that the cycles of life sort of remind us of this. And this is even evidenced in a really interesting YouTube video by somebody who was talking about atheism 2.0. So, which I won't get into very deeply, but I think that this speaks to the sort of rituals that I was just talking about. He talks about, timed out. When is it? Anyway, he talks about how, we sort of, atheism has said, okay, we don't believe in certain things, but now what? What's the next stage of if you're an atheist? I think this is it, right? It's not working. It timed out. It's so good. Sorry, they were open to the right moment. Now I have to start it again. Sorry, I'm just going to...
Again and again and again. You won't do that by accident.
Sorry, okay. Almost there.
What she says is so clever. You feel cheated. Not so if you're adopting a religious mindset. The other thing that religions do is to arrange time. All the major religions give us calendars. What is a calendar? A calendar is a way of making sure that across the year you will bump into certain very important ideas. In the Catholic chronology, Catholic calendar, at the end of March you will think about St. Jerome and his qualities of humility and goodness and his generosity to the poor. You won't do that by accident, you will do that because you are guided to do that. And we don't think that way. In the secular world, we think if an idea is important, I'll bump into it. I'll just reinforce it. Nonsense, says the religious worldview. Religious worldview says we need calendars, we need to structure time, we need to synchronize encounters. This comes across also in the way in which religions set up rituals around important feelings. Take the moon. It's really important to look at the moon. When you look at the moon, you think I'm really small, what are my problems, sets things in perspective, etc., etc. We should all look at the moon a bit more often. We don't. Why don't we? Well, there's nothing to tell us, look at the moon. But if you're a Zen Buddhist in the middle of September, you will be ordered out of your home, made to stand on a canonical platform, and made to celebrate the festival of Tsukimi, where you will be given poems to read in honor of the moon and the passage of time and the frailty of life that it should remind us of. You'll be handed rice cakes, and the moon and the reflection on the moon will have a secure place in your heart.
Okay, so you see here, he's talking about the importance of rituals and he goes on to say, atheism, maybe we need some guidance, maybe we need something to tell us, to remind us of these things in life that we do value, but we don't have a religious institution to remind us of. And so I sort of wanted to end on this sort of idea of whether you sort of you feel active or passive in your religious affiliations or beliefs of any kind. So are you sort of accepting life as it is, and you just have to deal with it and get through life, sort of self-surrender path, which maybe some of the Protestant religions might have been promoting a little bit more. Or, and this is, either one could lead to a sustainable end. It's just sort of a final note question. Or are you sort of feeling the sort of open and optimistic path of religion? Or do you feel, a sense of expansion, and how is this going to help you or incorporating sustainability into your beliefs or religious practices? And so here is a host of list of the religious groups on UCI's campus. There's quite a few. I believe it was 59 or 58. Oh, I have to move my clicker thing. Oh, sorry. So just think, maybe some of you guys are members, maybe you aren't. If you are a member, how could you think about what we talked about today? How could you be incorporating, or how is your religion already have many readings from scriptures that are related to sustainability? How are we going to close this public narrative, this public gap, this perceived gap between religion and sustainability and spiritual issues? And how can these groups talk to the environmental groups on campus? There's a host of environmental groups as well. We could put an event on together. I'd be happy to help out. Just think about that. This is your campus, and this is, you know, your lives. And if you're active or passively oriented, or any of the religions, or atheist, as we talked about today, think about how this can be integrated into your life, or integrated into the lives of the people you know. So basically, it's what, you know, I want you to leave with the question of what are you going to do? Are you going to go home and talk to your friends, your parents, or your places of worship, your rabbis and priests and scholars, anyone who shares similar beliefs to you? And so we're going to sort of go back to the question that we posed at the beginning that Gary Gardner posed. Do you think we can achieve sustainability without religion? And do you think religion, and vice versa, do you think religion and its practices and beliefs should be considering sustainability more as if they're going to stay true to what they say is true in life? And one way that you can do this, here's two examples. You know, there's a toolkit for sustainability in higher education, made by the Catholic Covenant. And on the right, Gary Gardner also started the Earth Charter Initiative. And here we have people started with the explicit intent of going to religious institutions and asking them to accept, do you see climate change as an issue in your religion? Do you see how it's integrated in your religious worldview and doctrines? And they sign on and they work together to achieve greater ends, I think. So I encourage you to take the next step, and thank you for listening.